Welcome, fourth graders, to the Dallas Independent School District STEM Environmental Education Center. And we'd like to give a special welcome to a bunch of schools this afternoon. We have Kaye Elementary with us from the Dallas Independent School District, Theodore Roosevelt Elementary from the Manhattan Ogden Independent School District, Lorenzo de Zavala, Sudie Williams, the Solar Preparatory School for Girls, and Martha Turner Riley Elementary Schools from the Dallas Independent School District, Forest Ridge Elementary from Richardson ISD, McShann Elementary from Dallas ISD, and last but not least, Spicewood Park from Southwest ISD. Thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon. We wish you could be here in person, but you wouldn't fit in our center. There's too many schools to fit in our little center, but since we can do this virtually, it's going to work out just fine. If you are watching this and you have not registered for this field trip yet, you can still do that by going to www.tiny.cc/EEC register. And once you get there, you can get yourself or your class registered for this afternoon's trip. We just use that information for our attendance purposes. And this afternoon's field trip is going to be all about properties of soils. During this virtual field trip, students will discover that Earth consists of useful resources. Students will examine properties of soils, including color and texture, the capacity to retain water, and the ability to support the growth of plants. So first, I'm going to give you an introduction to soil. Next, Mrs. Fuller is going to explore color and texture of soil. Third, Mr. Ramirez is going to do an investigation to test soil's capacity to retain water. And then Ms. Nash is going to explore soil's ability to support the growth of plants. While we're doing all of that, you can ask us questions, and we encourage you to ask questions. Since this is a virtual field trip, the way you do ask a question is you need to go to www.tiny.cc/EEC-question-answer. And once you get there, you'll fill out a super short form to submit your questions about properties of soils to us. You can ask as many questions as you like, and we'll do our best to answer all of them in the time that we have with you this afternoon. So let me jump out of this presentation and into this one to get started with that introduction to soil. And when we talk about soil, we first should know what soil is. So soil forms in layers. The top layer is called topsoil. The layer underneath that is called subsoil. Underneath that is parent rock. And then if you go down far enough, you'll finally hit bedrock. So that's kind of your four basic layers of soil. And then what is soil? So it's these five things right here. You've got small pieces of rocks and minerals. There's plant and animal remains. That means that a plant or animal or both have died and their body's laying on the ground and is decomposing, and their remains are getting broken down by decomposers and going back into the soil to put nutrients in the soil for plants. There are also living organisms in the soil. So there are worms living in the soil, bacteria, mammals burrow into the soil to make their home. There's a whole world of living organisms living in the soil. And then there's also air and water down in the soil so that the plants and animals that live there can survive. Now, why is soil important? Soil is one of our most important natural resources. And this picture here kind of shows one reason why. And it's because soil gives plants a place to anchor themselves to the ground. If it weren't for soil, plants would just fall over because they wouldn't have any soil to anchor them, for the roots to anchor them to the ground, or they get blown away by the wind. And actually, plants are important for soil because plants hold the soil in place, so they benefit each other. And then again, going back to why soil is important, not just to anchor those plants, but it has nutrients for them to grow. But if it weren't for soil and plants working together, life on Earth would be very difficult. And just to give an example of that, since this is a virtual field trip, we're going to use our imagination and we're going to travel to an area northwest of Dallas. And since this is virtual, we can travel back in time as well. We're going to go back in time about 100 years to the 1920s, and we're going to visit an area in the United States called the Dust Bowl. So the Dust Bowl is this area right here. It was about half of Kansas, the Oklahoma Panhandle, a big chunk of the Texas Panhandle, and a little bit of New Mexico and Colorado. So a pretty big area of land. And what happened there in the 1920s is that people overused that land. They over cultivated the land to grow wheat. So that means they plowed up all the land and took the plants off of the land to plant wheat. They overgrazed some areas of that land with animals. They cut down what few trees that were there for lumber. They just didn't take care of the land very well, and that area only receives about 20 inches of rainfall every year on a normal year. But in the early 30s, there was a severe drought. That means they got no rain for a long time, and that exposed topsoil that had been plowed up or overgrazed or trees were cut off of it was exposed and became very dry and then became very easily eroded by the wind, or that means blown away by the wind. And so that's the map, but this is how it looked if you lived there during that time. So there you can see Texas in 1935. And that was, a big dust storm because of all that dry topsoil that was getting blown around by the wind heading towards these houses. So it was miserable to live there in the mid 1930s because it was so dusty. They had a difficult time getting things to grow. They called these dust storms black blizzards because instead of a white blizzard of snow in the north during winter, it was a blizzard of dust and black dirt that was getting blown up by the wind. And it was hard. I mean, very difficult to breathe in that. It was really difficult to live in that area. There's Kansas in 1935. So you can see that whole town, that little town there's about to be engulfed in a dust storm or a black blizzard because they had left too much ground uncovered, like with no plants covering that topsoil, and then the wind was able to easily pick it up and blow that dust all over the place. And there's Oklahoma in 1937, and this farm has been abandoned. People just couldn't take it anymore. It was too dusty. Plants wouldn't grow, so it was just too miserable to live there. So thousands and thousands of families moved out of the Dust Bowl and they had to move somewhere else because they couldn't live there anymore. And so what people did to fix that problem was they started planting trees. So here you can see a 3-year-old tree farm forming a windbreak in 1935. Those trees aren't very tall yet because they're only 3 years old, but they planted rows of trees like this to stop the wind or at least slow it down so that it couldn't blow the topsoil around and create those dust storms. And just to give you an idea of how many trees they planted, one federal project oversaw the planting of 200 million trees in a 100-mile wide, 1,000-mile long barricade designed to stop wind erosion. So they planted lots and millions of trees to fix this problem, and it worked. By the 1940s, a lot of the Dust Bowl had recovered or was in the process of recovering. Plants were starting to grow back, especially grasses, and then those plants would hold the soil in place, and the dust storms finally stopped. So if you visit that area today, it looks like this. So you can see the grass has grown back now. The air is much cleaner. There's nice blue skies in this picture, and there's no more dust storms like there used to be in the 30s. It's a much better looking area. They still grow wheat there. Kansas is the wheat state, so they grow a lot of wheat in Kansas, but they're doing it much more responsibly now. They learned from their mistakes in the 20s and 30s, and they are growing things the way it's supposed to be and taking care of the land. So there's another picture of an area that was once the Dust Bowl, but you can see the grass is growing back now. Trees have grown up. It's much prettier. And even if the wind blows, it's not going to pick up a bunch of dry topsoil because those plants are there to hold it in place. And there's one last picture. So you can see some parts are very pretty to visit. So it's a nice area now because people are taking care of the land and not leaving so much topsoil exposed. So one reason soil is important is to give plants a place to anchor themselves to the ground. Another reason is important is getting into this picture. So now we're jumping to present day, and also this is not the Dust Bowl anymore. This is Sunnyvale, Texas, which is a suburb of Dallas, and that is a friend of mine's backyard. He is digging a great big hole in his backyard. There's a little better picture of the equipment he's using. So you can see he's dug up a lot of soil. It's a pretty deep hole. There's one last picture of it. And the reason he is digging down so far is he's building a barn in his backyard. So he dug down through, it looks like about 1, 2, 3, 4 or so layers of soil to get down to good soil so he can build a really strong foundation for his barn. Because if you're going to build a building like a barn or a house or an offices or apartments or any building, that's very expensive. And so you've got to put a very good foundation underneath it so that the building lasts for years and years. You want a building to last hopefully 100 years or more. And if you build it right and you have a good foundation and good soil, it will last. But soil is important for our buildings and roads. If you've ever seen road construction, a lot of times the state digs down quite a ways in the soil before they start building that road because it needs a good foundation for the roads too, so they last because they're also expensive to build. And then probably the most important reason that soil is so important is that is where we grow a lot of our food. So there's one of our vegetable raised beds in our center's garden. I think that is cucumbers maybe that I planted there one spring, and you can see they're growing in nice nutrient rich potting soil. And if you give them good soil to grow in, they grow much better. Those are some tomato plants, again, growing in good nutrient rich potting soil. There's some corn. And if you're wondering why is this corn so much bigger than like this one or even this one, it's because one day I left the gate open to our garden and one or two cows got in and ate a lot of that corn, and I had to replant, but they missed this one, so he grew nice and tall, and eventually those caught up. But that's what happened that day. So now I close that gate. That is crookneck squash growing in the soil. That's okra. Again, it's got to have good soil to grow. Okra is a native plant of Africa, but it grows very well in Texas too. There's those tomato plants after a month or so of growth. So you can see they're growing up nice and tall because they've got good soil to grow in. This right here is watermelon, but this giant leaf behind it is a zucchini, but they both need good soil to grow in. And if you give plants good soil and water and sunlight, you'll get fruits and vegetables. So there's a watermelon that finally grew. And we grow those fruits and vegetables here to feed our animals. We have all kinds of mammals, reptiles, amphibians, birds, and fish. And a lot of them like to eat the plants that we grow in our garden. Watermelon is one of the favorite foods of our tortoises that we have here. So soil is important for giving plants a place to grow, providing a foundation for our buildings and roads, and our food comes from soil. And then one last reason it's so important is that lots of living things live in the soil. Mammals burrow into the soil to make their home underground. Worms, protozoans, bacteria, fungi all live in the soil. And so there's a whole world of life going on down there. And if it weren't for soil, they would have nowhere to live and they would probably die. Even birds that wouldn't necessarily live in the soil depend on the soil because the insects that do live in the soil are their food. So you can see soil is very important. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen here now and go to questions. Bunch of questions. Okay, how deep is each layer of soil? That comes from Zoe at Sudi Williams. It depends. Some layers of soil are very thin, some are very thick. In fact, all layers of soil in some areas only add up to just inches, whereas in other places the layers add up to over 6 feet. So it depends on the soil. And Stella asked, when you get to bedrock, what happens? Usually you can dig past the bedrock, but you're just going to hit more rock. And mostly people stop when they get to bedrock because it's very hard to dig through. You're going to need some heavy equipment to get through that. But now we're going to move on to color and texture of soil with Mrs. Fuller.
Hi, boys and girls. We're going to be talking about texture of soil and also color. We're going to start with texture. And when we talk about texture, I'm not addressing the humus issue here in soil. I'm only talking about the abiotic part, the sediment part. And from 4th grade, you learned that sediment is broken pieces of rock. So soil has 3 different fractions, 3 different parts. It's got a sand component, a sediment, a silt component, and a clay component. And then those three, in their various percentages within the soil, are going to present the different kinds of textures. So we're going to have sandy loam, we're going to have a loamy soil, we're going to have a clayey soil. So let's talk about what we have here in north central Texas, actually an arc through the state. Our ecoregion here, starting in Bonham up here and arcing down to San Antonio, is called the Blackland Prairie. The Blackland Prairie is the most endangered ecosystem in North America. Actually, only 1% remains in its original condition. All the rest is covered by agriculture, farms and ranches, and urban sprawl, cities, towns, highways, etc. So most of what we have is not in its original state. Our soil here is called Houston Black. It's actually the state soil of Texas. I'm going to show you some. I dug this out outside a little while ago. This is what it looks like. You can see it's full of roots and it's got grasses. Most of this is coastal Bermuda on the top. Coastal Bermuda, of course, is not a native grass. It's a lawn grass that's grown here in Texas. But the native grasses like switchgrass and Indian grass and little blue stem and big blue stem and bushy blue stem, not much of that remains around here anymore. But those are the grasses that cause the soil to become so deep and rich. And it's the reason why the soil is so dark is because of the plant component that over thousands of years has lived and died, and their roots are very, very long and very strong. The roots go down anywhere from 5, 10, even 15 feet in the case of a couple of prairie grasses. So we've got a thick prairie soil. Our prairie soil here is called a vertisol. Well, you can't see it because of the paper. This thing right here, you see how dark that is? That's a Houston Black. Houston Black is the state soil of Texas, but it's also the soil of the Blackland Prairie as we come down from up here all the way down to San Antonio. Now, I know some of y'all don't live here in Texas. Some of y'all live up there in Kansas. So I looked up your state soil. You also have a prairie soil, but you've got a different mix because our underlying bedrock is calcareous material from the Cretaceous area. I've got a piece of it. This is our bedrock. It's called Austin chalk. It's a type of limestone. It gets acted on by water hydrolysis, which converts it to clay. So our soil, the Houston Black, is a heavy clay soil. It is about 60% clay. Your soil up there in Kansas is different because you've got a different bedrock underneath yours. Your soil is a mollisol. Ours, the Houston Black, is a vertisol because of the heavy clay content. Yours is a mollisol. Your state soil is Harney silt loam, and it's been your state soil since 1990. Your governor, Mike Hayden, signed it into law. And your soil, a mollisol is a very classic prairie type soil. It's very deep. Our soil, our Houston Black, is about 80 inches deep. It's very deep also. And ironically, even though both of them have different components of that sediment size fragment, the sand, the silt, the clay, they both have the same color. So let me show you on a chart here. This is called a Munsell color chart. Podologists, those are scientists that study soils, use this. You can take it out in the field. The sheets are real slick, and it's got this really neat system. It's got holes in it. And you take the sample of your soil. Here's some Houston Black that I mashed together about an hour ago. And you put it behind those little windows and see which one it matches. Now, obviously, it's not up here at an 8, so we're going to put it way down here. And there's a perfect match right there, 4.2, dark grayish brown. So I don't have a sample of Kansas mollisol, your Harney silt loam, but guess what? I looked you up on the internet and your soil color is dark grayish brown. So even though they've got different components, yours has a really heavy silt component, ours has a heavy clay component, they have the same color. All right, now, here is our environmental center is on a farm. We've got 240 acres. On a different part of the farm, I got this soil, and this soil has a high sand content. It doesn't have very much clay in it. Can't get it to stick together. But I put it on the color chart, and the color chart tells us, I don't know where I said it now. There it is. The color chart tells us that the color on that is dark yellowish brown. Now, just by looking at this, I wouldn't have chosen that as a name, but that's, according to the Munsell color chart, that's the name of this color. Okay, so remember, the Houston Black is a vertisol, the Harney Silt Loam is a mollisol. That's both of those are important to remember. Also, it takes 500 years for 1 inch of soil to form because rock breaks down very slowly. And I have one more thing, and I don't see it, but it was for the teachers. And oh, here it is. This is a website. No matter what state you're in, you can go to this website and you can get information about your state soil. So it's soilsforteachers.org/state-soils. So write that down and you can get some really good soils booklet for your soil in your state for your kids. All right, I think I'm just about out of time. It's been a joy talking with you, and soils are fascinating. I hope you really enjoy this unit. I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Broughton if you have any questions about texture or color in soils.
Thank you, Mrs. Fuller. We've got a bunch of questions, so I'm going to see how many I can get answered in about 1 minute. Charlie from Sudie Williams asks, do the plant or animal remains create fossil fuels? They can under the right conditions, but that takes millions of years for fossil fuels to form. Brian at Forest Ridge asked, do you know what's under bedrock? It's the Earth's crust. So that's the outer layer of the Earth. When you think of the 4 main layers, you got the inner core, outer core, mantle, and crust. Arlene at Forest Ridge asks, what are minerals made of? And they are made of elements. So if you ever look at the periodic table of elements, those are what make up minerals. Quinn at Sudie William asks, do plants need bedrock to grow? Without it, does it just fall? They kind of do need bedrock because we don't go from a layer of soil to the mantle, which is molten magma down there, like melted rock. There has to be solid rock in between, and that is the bedrock or the crust. So yes. And how do roots grow in soil? They push their way through the soil and they take in nutrients and water from the soil to help the plant grow. All right, now we're going to move on to the soil's capacity to retain water investigation with Ms. Ramirez.
Hello, my name is Ms. Ramirez, and in this segment, we're going to be examining soil capacity to retain water. So what exactly does retain mean? So retain just means the ability to hold or keep water in. So for example, the easiest thing you guys probably can think of is a sponge. So a sponge is pretty good at retaining or holding water. So here we have a beaker. If I put my sponge inside of it, it will actually hold some of that water in the sponge. So some soils can actually retain or hold water too. So that's what we're going to be investigating in this segment. So we're going to be testing loamy soil, sandy soil, and clay soil. So while I'm getting my iPad paired so that we can do the experiment, be thinking about which soil type do you think will retain the most water and why? So it might take me just a second to get my iPad linked up, and I will let you know just beforehand, the earlier session, my audio was not linking in with my visuals. It was just delayed. So if that happens, I apologize. There's some issues with internet connectivity, but you will see it and you will hear it. It just might be delayed. So here are our soil samples that we see here. And this is our first soil. Oh, and if you have a science journal or a paper and pencil, something to write with, this would be a good time to get that science tools out so that you guys can write down, draw, and make observations of the soils that we're looking at today. So the first soil we're going to look at is loamy soil. So as I'm talking about it, be writing or drawing it or describing what you're seeing. So this is the loamy soil, and loam soil is made out of humus, and humus is mostly dead organic matter. So think of plants and animals when they die, that makes up the humus. It also has sand, clay, and silt in it as well. So loam has a lot of different things, and you can see describe the color and the texture of what you're seeing here, and as well as the particle size. So what do you guys think those long pieces are right over here? Our next soil type is sand, and think about the color of it, the texture, and also the particle size as well. So y'all might be familiar with sand because if you've ever been to a beach, it looks pretty much like that. We also have a lot of sandy soils out here. And then our next soil type is clay. Now look how chunky the clay soil is. Now, even though these are big chunks, these big chunks are made out of super, super tiny clay particles that are very fine and tiny. So out of the 3 soil types that we have here, clay is the smallest of the particle sizes. So it is super tiny particles. They are 1/256th of a millimeter, so super tiny. And compare that to sand. Sand is 2 millimeters. So they are actually rather large particles. Now keep in mind, my little drawings of these dots here are not to scale, but just know that clay has super, super tiny particles. And then here's a big clump of clay as well. So do you think you can make sand and loam form these big clumps like clay has? So these are the 3 soil types we're going to be testing. And here's our test demonstration over here. So what I have is I have 3 cups inside 3 beakers, and each cup has the same amount of soil inside. And the cups also have holes at the bottom. So all I did was take a sewing needle and I poked the same number of holes into each cup. That way they're all the same. And what we're going to do, we're going to pour 50 milliliters of water into each of the soil cups. And we're going to see how much water is retained or kept in the soil. Now, any water that falls through the cup is water that is lost. So the water in the soil is retained, and any water that falls out is the lost water. So theoretically, if I had multiple people in the room, I would dump the water all at the same time. But because I'm only one person, I'm just going to do it one at a time since I only have one free hand. So hopefully you guys already made your prediction. Which one do you think will keep the most water and why? And hopefully you guys are able to see our first 2, the loamy soil. So this is loamy and this is sandy. Hopefully you can see that our sandy soil is losing water pretty fast. You can see those droplets. Our loamy soil is also losing water, but not as fast as that sandy soil. Now let's take a look at the clay soil. I don't see any water loss. So that means that most of the, or all the water, actually, all the water that I dropped in here is still inside the soil. So it's being retained. So now let's take a look at what the soil looks when it's wet. So again, you can still see the soil that's losing the most water is sand, followed by loam, and then clay is last. So let's take a look at what it looks like when they're wet. So here's our loamy soil. It's nice, rich, and black, pretty moist. Usually this is what we would put our plants in when we try and plant them. So it kind of has a medium water retention. Here's our sandy soil. The sandy soil lost the most amount of water. So pretty much as soon as I dumped that water in there, the water went straight through the sand and right on through. So sandy soil loses the most water, therefore it retains the least. Here's our clay soil. Now the clay soil retains the most, you can see the water is still in the cup. It hasn't percolated or made its way through the soil yet. So this clay soil, because the particles of clay are super tiny, it's preventing that water from seeping through. So particle size affects how well soil will drain. So this is the clay soil. And again, clay soil retained the most. And you can see, we know that because it didn't lose any water in this experiment. So I'm gonna go ahead and wipe my hands really quick so we can look at our next one. There's another soil type that we didn't test, and that is soil from a vermicompost. And a vermicompost is just a box filled with hundreds of worms. And I am essentially creating my own humus. And humus is just a rich mixture of decomposed or broken down remains of plants and animals. Now, because this is my personal compost bin that I use for class, I'm only putting broken down plant material. I'm not putting any dead animals because I have to touch it. But definitely outside, the humus could be made out of plant and animal remains. And again, because these are my pet worms, they're eating plant material, so grass, leaves, fruit, and veggies. And if we take a look inside, you can make some observations about what y'all are seeing. We do have newspaper. The newspaper is the worm Betty. And then we have food scraps. Eventually, the worms, which are decomposers, will break down all of this stuff, including the newspaper, and it will become part of the humus as well. So let's dig around and see if we can find any worms in here. They might all be hiding from me. So here we have a few of them in there. Let me pull them out. So these are red worms, and red worms are good decomposers to have in a vermicompost. They can eat about their same body weight. So however much a worm weighs, that's about how much food they can eat in a day. So they can actually eat a lot. And they are helping to decompose and break down the newspaper and my food waste, and they're turning it into this nice, nutritious soil filled with lots of humus that we can then put in our gardens and for plants to grow. So it has lots of nutrients from the dead stuff. So I'm gonna go ahead and put our wormy friends back up and kind of shake off some of that dirt there. And then we're going to come back to our screen, and I'm going to stop my screen share. And then the next thing we're going to do, I need to wipe my hands really quick. The next thing that we're going to do is you can actually repeat the same experiment at home or at school. Again, it was super easy to just take a cup and poke holes at the bottom and then drop water in it. And something you can do is create your own table or your own chart. So this is soil type and amount of water loss. So I did water loss, but you could do the amount of water retained. So remember in our little diagram, the amount of water lost was the water that fell. The water retained is water that's still left inside the soil cup. So then you could time it. So how much soil is lost or retained in 5 minutes, 90 minutes, 1 day, or 3 days. So it's interesting to see how long it takes for all that water to fall through and drop. And the next thing I'm going to do, I'm just going to share my desktop screen really quick so that you guys can see a couple of pictures. This one is a close-up of that sand, and you can see how big those sand particles are. And because those particles are bigger, water is able to flow through it easily and more quickly. And that's why it lost so much water so quick. Here's our clay. Again, it looks like big clumps, but those big clumps are actually made out of super tiny particles. And because those particles are so small, they are tightly compacted together, and that prevents water from passing through it. And then here's our loamy soil. So you can see those big chunks of organic matter of the leaves and branches and sticks. And then in this next little video, this is from a walk through our Post Oak Preserve in the little woods across the street from us. So you can see that it has a rather sandy soil component there. And you can see a lot of that leaf litter and that humus that makes up the soil across the street in the Post Oak Preserve. So pretty interesting to see how just walking around the facility, the soil type varies between clay-like soils, loamy soils, sandy soils. So it's very interesting to study. And there's another little decomposer I found. So I'm going to stop my screen share and just a quick little review. We know from our experiment that the sandy soil retained the least. And that is because it lost so much water going through. The clay soil actually retained the most, and none of that water so far has even left the soil cup. So that's the clay soil. So think about, how does water retention affect plants, or why is it even important to learn about water retention? And then my challenge for you guys is to compare the soil retention properties of different soils where you live. So it's something cool y'all can do is everyone can go home, take a cup and bring back a cup of soil from wherever you live, and then y'all can do your own little soil experiment back in your class. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it back to Mr. Broughton, and he's going to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Ramirez. One of the questions that we got was, how many different types of soil are there? That is from Piper at Bluemont, and it depends on how specific you want to get. Some websites say as few as 3 types, some say as many as 12 types. So it just depends on how specific you want to get, because it's not that one is right and one's wrong. It's kind of an opinion, I guess, or really how specific you want to get about it. And then another question is, Vo asked, do plants have different soil preferences? Yes, they do, and we're about to get into that with Miss Nash. She's going to discuss plant or soil's ability to support different plants.
Hello, welcome to my classroom. And yes, we're going to talk about plants and soil because it's so interesting. It's a great question. There are lots of different soils. So these are the main soil types. That was another good question. You can break them down farther, but in general, these are our main soil types. Lots of different colors, lots of different textures. And the reason they're different colors and different textures is they have different amounts of organic matter, and the parent rock is different. So that makes them a different color, a different texture. So different soils can support different kinds of plants, and plants have their own preferences. It's like saying, what kind of cookie is best? Well, you might like chocolate chip, and I might like oatmeal. So the plants are kind of the same way. Some like one kind and some like another. Let's look at that a little bit. I'll share my screen. There we go. So we can look at where we are now. So most of this part of Texas was once the Blackland Prairie. It was from here to Canada. And grasses and other plants grew and died and decomposed. Animals went through, ate it, died, pooped on it, and it formed some of the deepest, richest soils on the planet. And you can see there on the right, the deep, deep roots going down, down, down. This original prairie has disappeared almost completely. It's been replaced by domestic plants like corn and wheat, domestic animals like cows and pigs, and cities. If we go west from here, there's less and less rainfall until you get to a real desert. Cactus are adapted to that lack of water in the dry, rocky, sandy soil. Most other plants could not survive. But cactus have done something amazing. They have lost their leaves as a way to keep from losing too much water. And the desert has lots and lots of different kinds of plants and animals, but that poor soil and the lack of rain makes survival a challenge. If you go east and south from here, you'll find a different environment with lots of rain. You'll find bogs and swamps. And in a bog or a swamp, the soil is what we call saturated. That means it's full of water. And most plants can't live there because the soil doesn't have any oxygen in it. But some plants, like that bald cypress, are very well adapted. They grow right in the water. Another interesting thing about bogs and swamps is that nutrients are washed away by all the water. Some plants have adapted to this by becoming carnivorous or insectivores. And you can see a Venus flytrap on the left, a sundew in the middle, and a pitcher plant on the right. And you can find some of these in Southeast Texas, actually. And because there's no nutrient in the soil, they trap insects and use the nutrients from the insects. Pretty amazing. And of course, we always think of plants, we think of a rainforest. It's the biggest plants on the planet, the greatest diversity of plants and animals, plants growing up into the trees, the vines, plants growing all over the trees, the epiphytes, and then the giant trees. But the interesting thing is that that soil is really not very good. There's very little topsoil, that nutrient-rich section, that decomposed layer, because there's so much heat and rainfall, the rate of decomposition is really rapid. And the trees basically are feeding themselves. If you cut down those trees, you end up with rocky soil that's not good for very much. Okay? So we need to preserve that rainforest, okay, for all of us. So I'm going to stop sharing. And we're going to think about 2 different kinds of plants and what kind of soil they might like. So I have a little fern here. Now, a fern will grow in a forest under the shade of trees, and they like a little bit extra water. So if I put this one out in the sun and don't give it any water, it will die. So for soil for a fern like this, so soil is made of 4 things. Inorganic matter, that's the broken down rock. Organic matter, that's dead plants and animals, the living plants and animals in there, and air and water. That's all. So if I'm going to make soil for my fern, I'm going to use some of this nice piece of a dead tree I found, and I pulled out all that dead decomposed bark. Okay, put some of that in. They'll like that. I've got some sand. I put a little bit of sand in just because we don't want it to be too clogged up. And then, I got this from Miss Juanita's worms. So this is what we call worm castings, and it's actually worm poop. And they eat all that yummy stuff and they poop it out. And there it is. It's full of nutrients and plants love it. So I'm going to give that fern a lot of that. Yummy. And now we mixed all that up for my fern. I look at the color. Okay. I look at the color. I feel the texture. And I'd say, I think that would be good for the roots of my fern to grow in. Now, if I want to plant a cactus like my little Stapelia here, I'm going to need different soil. Because the cactus doesn't like a lot of water. If I give the cactus the same soil and the same amount of water as my fern, the cactus will die. If I give the fern the same soil and water as my cactus, the fern will die. So I have to think about that. So for my cactus, what do you think? So I'll start again with that bark, because they do like some organic matter. But what about sand? I think I better put more sand in, because we want that soil to drain quickly, and we don't want it to be too rich. So I'm putting a lot of sand. And then what about the worm castings? I'm going to give them some, because it's the best. I mix that all up. Look at it and think. So different color, okay, here's all that sand. I can feel it with my hand. It's a little bit grainier, so the water's going to go right through it, okay, which is good for a cactus. So different kinds of plants need different kinds of soil. And you can do some observation of this. You can run your own test. You can fill little pots with soil and put seeds, different kinds of soil, put seeds in it and see which grows your best plants. Okay? You can also take a walk. Take a walk around and see if you can find different kinds of soil. You just dig down a little stick down to the plants and look at the color, to feel the texture, and make an observation. Take some notes. What plants are growing there? Go to a different place and try again. And you can make some comparisons between the soil that you find and the plants that grow there. So it's an interesting thing to observe and study. And if you have any more questions, you can ask Mr. Broughton.
Thank you, Ms. Nash. We're about out of time, so I'm going to have to email your teacher the answer to the questions that I didn't get to. So she'll get that email, or he'll get that email within a day or two, and then you'll get the answers to those. But right now I'm going to share my screen here one more time so we can do a quick recap of what we did today. So today's virtual field trip was all about properties of soils. During this trip, students discover that Earth consists of useful resources. Students examine properties of soils, including color and texture, the capacity to retain water, and the ability to support the growth of plants. So we started off with that introduction to soil and why it's so important. Next, we examined the color and texture of soil with Mrs. Fuller. Then we investigated soil's capacity to retain water with Mr. Ramirez. And last, we explored soil's ability to support the growth of plants with Ms. Nash. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We appreciate you taking the time to learn about properties of soils with us. We hope you enjoyed this virtual field trip, and you can let us know if you did or not by going to www.tiny.cc/EEC feedback and filling out a short feedback form for us. Have a great winter break, and we will see you during our next virtual field trip for fourth graders after the break. Enjoy the rest of your day.